Tonight, you'll uncover the most powerful secret Buddhist monks have used for over 2,500 years on transforming a restless, worry-filled mind into a grateful heart that sleeps in profound peace. I'll share with you the 8 most transformative stories on gratitude I've learned from years studying the deepest Buddhist teachings in Tibetan monasteries, Japanese temples, and Indian ashrams. Each story holds a hidden key that can completely change how you see your life even during the toughest times and transform chronic dissatisfaction into genuine appreciation. These aren't just bedtime stories. They're ancestral antidotes to the complaining mind, the never-satisfied heart, and the soul that's forgotten how to find beauty in simply being alive. Over the next 2 hours, you'll discover why the wise say, "He who sleeps grateful awakens renewed," and how small shifts in perspective can create profound transformations in the quality of your sleep and dreams. So adjust your pillow, take a deep breath with me now, and prepare for a journey that will change not only tonight, but all the nights that follow. The first story happened in a monastery lost in the mountains of the Himalayas, where a young monk was about to learn the most important lesson of his life. Story 1. Monk Tenzin and the last grain of rice in the icy Himalayas, where the air is so thin each breath feels like a whispered prayer to the heavens, stood the monastery of eternal serenity. Built over 800 years ago into the red cliffs of an impossible precipice, the monastery seemed to sprout from the mountain itself, a natural extension of the sacred stone. There lived a 22-year-old monk named Tenzin, who had left an extremely comfortable life in Kathmandu 6 months prior to seek spiritual enlightenment. The son of a prosperous silk and spice merchant, Tenzin had grown accustomed to abundant meals, soft clothing, and a warm bed every night. His decision to become a monk had shocked his entire family, especially his mother, who wept for 3 straight days when he announced his departure. But a growing problem threatened his stay at the monastery. Tenzin constantly complained about absolutely everything. The barley soup was too bland, the straw mattress uncomfortably hard for his silk-accustomed back. Mornings started too early at 4 a.m. Meditations were too long for his restless legs. The silence was oppressive to his talkative mind, and the biting cold of the stone corridors made his bones ache constantly. His 15 fellow monks, simple men who had grown up in poor mountain villages, were visibly tired of his constant complaints echoing through the silent halls like stones thrown into a calm lake. Some whispered amongst themselves during rest periods that perhaps this wealthy young man could never truly understand the path of renunciation and contentment. Master Superior Kenji, a 73-year-old man with deep wrinkles etched by decades of contemplation and wise smiles, was seriously questioning whether this impatient young man truly possessed the necessary vocation for spiritual life, or was just another rich family's son playing at being holy. It was the 3rd week of December, the eve of the darkest new moon of the year, when a violent and unexpected blizzard descended from the mountains like an avalanche of wind and ice. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 consecutive nights, with winds so strong they made the monastery's thick stone walls tremble like leaves in the wind, and snow so dense it was impossible to see beyond 2 meters. All the narrow and dangerous trails connecting the monastery to the outside world were completely blocked by meters of fresh snow and treacherous ice sheets. There was absolutely no possibility of descending the mountain to seek supplies, nor of receiving visitors who usually brought donations of food and basic supplies. For 3 days they had been surviving only on the meager food reserves remaining in the monastery's small, underground storehouse, mostly brown rice, some dried vegetables preserved in coarse salt, and a small amount of sampa, the roasted barley flour that is the traditional Tibetan staple food. Master Kenji had carefully calculated and redistributed the portions so they could survive for another week, perhaps 10 days if they were extremely careful. Each monk would receive exactly 2 small spoons of rice per meal, a pinch of dried vegetables, and a handful of sampa mixed with yak butter tea on that frigid Thursday morning. As the first golden rays of sun began to filter through the small carved wooden windows, Tenzin descended the narrow stone stairs leading to the main refectory. His bare feet touched the smooth, cold stones that had been polished by centuries of contemplative steps from thousands of monks who had lived there before him. The refectory was a simple yet majestic room, with a high ceiling supported by thick, dark wooden beams, walls adorned with colorful thankas depicting compassionate Buddhas, and a small but elaborate altar where juniper incense constantly burned, filling the air with a sacred fragrance that calmed even the most restless mind. 15 simple earthenware bowls were carefully arranged on the single long wooden table, each containing the exact portion Master Kenji had calculated to ensure everyone's survival, until the storm passed and they could again receive supplies from the valley. Tenzin approached his usual bowlve, the 11th from left to right, where he had always sat since arriving at the monastery, and, when he looked inside the simple brown earthenware bowl, his young face immediately contorted into an expression of deep indignation and visible displeasure. The amount of rice seemed ridiculously small to his eyes, accustomed to abundance. 2 small spoons of whitish grains rested at the bottom of the bowl like scarce pearls in an empty ocean. "Master Kenji," he said loudly and clearly, not caring that his complaint echoed throughout the silent refectory and drew the embarrassed attention of all 15 monks present. "There are only 2 measly spoons of rice in my bowl. How can I meditate properly with my stomach constantly rumbling with hunger? How can I seek spiritual enlightenment if I am permanently distracted by this unpleasant and disturbing feeling of emptiness in my stomach? This is unworthy of a serious spiritual seeker." The other monks lowered their gazes in embarrassment, some discreetly shaking their heads in silent disapproval. It was Tenzin's 15th complaint that week alone, and everyone was starting to lose patience with this privileged young man who seemed unable to find contentment in any circumstance. Old Master Kenji, who had personally distributed each portion of food with his own wrinkled and hardened hands from decades of dedicated work, slowly raised his serene eyes and looked directly at Tenzin with an extraordinarily complex expression that mixed infinite patience, deep compassion, and something more, an ancestral wisdom that was about to reveal itself in a completely unexpected way. "Tenzin," the master said calmly, his soft but authoritative voice echoing with a natural reverberation through the refectory's thick stone walls, "come with me immediately. There is something extremely important I need to show you before you eat any of this food." Intrigued, but still visibly irritated by the unfair situation he found himself in, Tenzin got up with abrupt movements of impatience and followed the master through the cold and damp corridors of the monastery. His simple, yak leather sandals beat against the smooth stones worn by centuries of meditative steps, creating a rhythmic echo that seemed to accompany his breath quickened by irritation. They walked through several dark corridors lit only by butter lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. climbed narrow stone stairs, crossed empty meditation rooms, where the silence was so profound it seemed solid, until they finally reached a small arched window that offered a panoramic view of the deep, completely snow-covered valley hundreds of meters below. Master Kenji stopped before the window and made a silent gesture for Tenzin to approach and look through the thick, irregular glass that separated the heated interior from the biting cold outside. What Tenzin saw through that window left him instantly and completely speechless, as if someone had ripped all the air from his lungs at once. Hundreds of meters below, at the rocky base of the mountain, covered by 1.5 meters of fresh snow, there was a small Himalayan village with low stone and wood houses, and even with the strong wind of the storm still blowing occasionally, raising clouds of snow like white ghosts, they could see people moving slowly through the thick snow. They were thin, human figures, men, women, children, and elderly people, wearing ragged and visibly dirty clothes, walking with difficulty through the snow that reached their waists, carrying empty wicker baskets over their shoulders. Bent by the penetrating cold, prolonged hunger, and the exhaustion of days without any food. "Do you see those people down there, Tenzin?" the master asked softly, pointing with delicate precision, using his gnarled and wrinkled finger towards the distant figures moving like shadows in the white landscape. "For exactly 4 days and 4 nights they have not eaten absolutely anything, not a single grain of rice, not a leaf of vegetables, not a drop of yak milk, nothing." Tenzin swallowed hard, feeling for the first time in 6 months a sharp pang of genuine shame, growing in his young chest like a small but intense flame that began to warm regions of his heart that had long been cold and insensitive. But Master Kenji had not yet finished his transformative lesson. With deliberately slow and ceremonial movements, he took from the deep inner pocket of his brown robe something that made Tenzin's eyes widen completely in surprise and incomprehension: a single grain of rice, small and whitish, resting in the palm of his right hand as if it were a rare pearl or a precious diamond. "This grain," said the master with reverent solemnity, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger, as if he were handling the most valuable and sacred thing in the universe. This single small grain of rice represented the exact difference between life and death for a 3-year-old child in the neighboring mountain village last week. She ate only this grain for 2 whole days, chewing it slowly to make it last as long as possible, and it was enough to keep her alive until help arrived. Tenzin stared at that tiny grain between the master's experienced and wrinkled fingers. Suddenly, as if a dam had broken inside his mind, his consciousness was completely flooded by a powerful cascade of deep perceptions he had never even considered throughout his privileged life. End of excerpt. It was as if a thick, invisible curtain that had shrouded his eyes for years was instantly lifted, revealing a completely different reality that had always been there, but which he had never been able to see because of his limited and selfish perspective. In that sacred moment of revelation, he understood with crystalline clarity that there weren't simply 2 measly spoonfuls of rice in his bowl. There were thousands upon thousands of invisible and miraculous gifts, the dedicated and loving labor of countless people he would never meet, the unconditional and infinite generosity of Mother Earth producing food without asking for anything in return, the perfectly coordinated dance of sun and rain working together for months, the incomprehensible miracle of life gracefully transforming into nourishing food, and the essential kindness of the beings who had made his survival possible on that isolated mountain. His 2 spoonfuls of rice didn't represent scarcity or deprivation, they were pure, crystalline abundance disguised as simplicity, extraordinary wealth masked as modesty. Today, when you look at your plate of food, whether it's a hurried lunch during a work break or an elaborate dinner carefully prepared at home, how many times do you truly pause for a few seconds to contemplate and honor the infinite and miraculous chain of events that made that meal possible? When you truly understand this, not just intellectually with your rational mind, but with your heart completely open and receptive, complaining becomes literally impossible, and gratitude becomes as natural as breathing. Story 2. Trader Ricardo and the lost coins. Many hundreds of kilometers south of the Andes, in the dusty plains of northern Argentina, lay a thriving trading town called Salta, its narrow streets constantly buzzed with merchants, pilgrims, artisans, and travelers from all corners of the known world. Here lived Ricardo, an exceedingly successful trader in fine spices, precious silks, and rare jewels, who had built his fortune over 20 years of hard work and shrewd bargaining. Ricardo owned 3 enormous warehouses overflowing with valuable goods, a 17-room mansion adorned with the finest marbles and most exotic woods, 15 dedicated employees who catered to every aspect of his luxurious life, and subterranean vaults crammed with thousands of gold and silver coins that gleamed like earthly stars in the darkness. But despite this extraordinary material abundance, Ricardo was profoundly unhappy. He spent sleepless nights obsessively counting and recounting his coins as if they were grains of rice, constantly checking his stocks as if someone might steal them in his sleep, and perpetually worrying about the possibility of losing everything he had built with so much sweat and sacrifice. His wife, Isabella, a kind and patient woman who had endured her husband's escalating obsessions for years, constantly tried to remind him of all the blessings they possessed: robust health, 3 intelligent and loving children, a comfortable home that shielded them from the elements, abundant and delicious food every day, and enough resources to live with dignity and generosity for the rest of their lives. "Ricardo," she would say every morning as he nervously prepared for another day of compulsive work, "look around. We have everything any family could desire. When will you finally stop worrying and start enjoying the blessings life has given us so generously?" But Ricardo always responded in the same way: "Isabella, you don't understand the dangers of the business world. A single miscalculated transaction, a single theft, a single betrayal by a business partner, and we could lose everything overnight. I need to work harder, earn more, accumulate more, to protect our family from any possibility of future need." And so he continued his obsessive routine, waking before dawn to check his warehouses, spending the entire day negotiating with almost desperate intensity, and returning home at dusk, too exhausted to enjoy the company of his loving family, only to repeat the same cycle the following day. It was a Tuesday, in March, as the late summer heat began to give way to the intense heat of the Argentinian summer, that Ricardo decided to travel to the neighboring city of Cordoba for an important business transaction that could double his monthly profits. He had received an irresistible offer from a Persian merchant offering an extraordinary quantity of genuine saffron, the world's most valuable spice, at a price that seemed too good to be true. Ricardo carefully filled his 2 strongest leather bags with exactly 500 gold coins each, a considerable fortune representing years of careful saving and dedicated work. They were beautiful coins, some minted by the Incan emperors themselves, others from distant kingdoms, all perfectly polished and gleaming like tiny golden suns. He tied the bags with triple silk cords, carefully hid them inside a secret compartment of his most inconspicuous cart pulled by two gentle but strong oxen, and set off the following dawn while the streets were still deserted and silent. To avoid attracting the attention of potential thieves who might follow him down the road, the journey should have lasted only 2 days along relatively safe roads he had traveled dozens of times before. But what Ricardo didn't know was that fate had prepared for him a lesson that would fundamentally change his understanding of wealth, loss, and the true meaning of abundance. On the afternoon of the first day, when the sun was particularly intense and the heat made shimmering waves dance over the dusty road, Ricardo stopped near a small, crystalline stream to water the oxen and rest for a few hours during the hottest part of the day. It was a seemingly idyllic spot, with leafy trees offering generous shade and the soothing sound of running water that calmed the mind. While the oxen drank calmly and rested in the shade, Ricardo decided to check his precious coins once more. As he compulsively did several times a day, he opened the cart's secret compartment, took out the 2 heavy leather bags, and began his habitual obsessive count, arranging the coins in perfect stacks of 10 on a blanket spread on the ground. But then something completely unexpected happened. A sudden, strong gust of wind, the kind that arises out of nowhere in the late afternoon in northern Argentina, swept through the clearing like a gigantic, invisible hand. The blanket was violently lifted from the ground like a boat sail, and the 1,000 carefully arranged gold coins were scattered in every possible direction like golden seeds thrown by a mad sewer. Some coins flew directly into the stream, where they were immediately carried away by the current and disappeared forever with tiny golden sparkles under the water. Others were thrown into the dense, thorny vegetation surrounding the clearing, where it would be practically impossible to find them among leaves, branches, and stones. Many simply vanished into the tall grass and rocky crevices as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Ricardo remained paralyzed in absolute horror for several seconds that seemed like an eternity, watching his fortune disperse before his eyes as if he were living the worst nightmare of his life. Then he began a desperate and frantic search, crawling on his knees through the grass, searching every bush, sifting the mud of the stream with his bare hands until they became bloody and bruised. He searched until total darkness enveloped the forest and it became impossible to see anything. He searched throughout the following night in the dim light of a small oil lamp, without eating, without drinking water, without resting for a single moment. He searched throughout the following day under the scorching sun that burned his skin and left his lips cracked with thirst. After 2 days and 2 nights of obsessive and increasingly desperate searching, Ricardo had managed to recover only 43 coins. Out of the 1,000 he had lost, less than 5% of his fortune. 95% of the money that represented years of hard work had simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. Ricardo sat on a rock by the stream, completely exhausted, physically and emotionally devastated, holding the 43 recovered coins in his trembling, bruised hands. Tears of despair began to stream down his dirt and sweat-stained cheeks, as his mind was invaded by terrifying thoughts about how he would explain this catastrophic loss to his wife and children. "How am I going to support my family now?" he murmured to himself, his voice choked and almost inaudible. "How am I going to pay the employees? How am I going to keep the business running? Maybe I'll have to sell the house. Maybe we'll have to live in poverty for the rest of our lives." It was at this moment of absolute despair and total emotional darkness that Ricardo heard a soft, melodious voice coming from behind him. "Brother," the voice said with an infinite gentleness that seemed to carry all the compassion in the world, "why are you weeping with such bitterness on this beautiful morning?" Ricardo slowly turned around and saw a man, approximately his age, wearing the simple saffron robes of a Buddhist monk. The man had deep, serene eyes that shone with an inner peace Ricardo had never seen in any human being, and a genuine smile that radiated a goodness as natural as sunlight. "Master," Ricardo replied in a broken voice, "I lost almost everything I owned in the world. 95% of my fortune vanished in a matter of seconds because of a gust of wind. How can I not weep in the face of such a devastating tragedy?" The monk, who introduced himself as Bodhi, sat calmly beside Ricardo on the rock, contemplating the crystalline waters of the stream for a few moments in contemplative silence before answering. "My friend, Bodhi," finally said, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed to come from immense depths, "you said you lost almost everything you owned in the world, but I would like to ask a few simple questions, if you will allow me." Ricardo nodded, curious, despite his profound sadness. "Can you still breathe freely?" asked the monk. "Yes," Ricardo replied, slightly confused. "Can your eyes still see the beauty of this crystalline stream, these majestic trees, this infinite blue sky?" "Yes." "Can your legs still carry you back home, where your family awaits you with love?" "Yes, they can." "Can your mind still learn, create solutions, generate new ideas to rebuild your business?" "Well, yes, I suppose so." "Can your arms still work, your hands still create value, your heart still love and be loved?" "Yes, all of that is still true." "Then tell me," said Monk Bodhi, with a radiant smile that completely transformed his face, "what exactly did you lose that is truly essential to your happiness and well-being?" Ricardo opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. For the first time in his adult life, he truly stopped to consider this fundamental question, and what he discovered shocked him deeply. He had lost pieces of golden metal, inanimate objects, symbols of value that existed only because people agreed that they existed, but he had not lost absolutely anything that truly mattered for a full and meaningful life. "The coins," the monk continued gently, "were only tools. Useful, certainly, but only tools. You still possess all the true riches of life: health, family, skills, experience, the ability to love and be loved, the opportunity to serve other human beings through your work, and something even more precious, the chance to learn an extraordinary lesson about what truly constitutes true abundance." "But Master," protested Ricardo, still not completely convinced, "how am I going to rebuild my business? How am I going to support my family adequately?" "In the way you built your original wealth," Bodhi replied with serene confidence, "with your intelligence, your dedication, your experience, your relationships, your reputation, and your ability to create value for other people. All these true sources of prosperity remain intact within you. The coins were only the result of these capabilities, not the source of them. In fact," the monk continued with a special gleam in his eyes, "you may find that rebuilding with a different perspective, a perspective of gratitude for the abilities you possess instead of anxiety about the things you may lose, can make you not only more financially prosperous, but infinitely richer in inner peace and genuine satisfaction." At that moment, something fundamental transformed in Ricardo's consciousness. He understood that he had spent 20 years obsessively focusing on the fruits of his labor, the coins, the properties, the material objects, while completely ignoring the true roots of his prosperity, his health, his family, his skills, his network of relationships, his reputation, his experience, and his infinite capacity to create value through dedicated service to other people. The lost coins did not represent a tragedy, they represented a liberation from the constant anxiety of losing what he thought he possessed, and an opportunity to recognize and appreciate the true riches that no one could ever take from him. "Master Bodhi," said Ricardo, feeling a lightness growing in his chest, as if an immense weight were being gradually removed. "How can I thank you for this extraordinary lesson? Take this understanding back to your family," the monk replied with a radiant smile. "Share your true abundance, which is infinite, instead of worrying about protecting your material wealth, which is always temporary. And when you rebuild your business, as you surely will, do it from a place of gratitude and service, not fear and accumulation." Ricardo returned home that afternoon with only 43 coins in his pocket, but with a wealth in his heart that was worth more than all the treasures of the emperors. When he told his story to Isabella, she cried, not out of sadness for the financial loss, but out of joy at having her true husband back after years of anxiety and obsession. In the following months, Ricardo rebuilt his business with an energy and creativity that surprised even his most experienced competitors. But this time, he worked with genuine gratitude for the opportunity to serve his clients, true joy at being able to support his family, and a deep peace that came from knowing that his true wealth, his ability to love, create, and contribute, could never be lost in a gust of wind. And this radical transformation of perspective on wealth and loss reminds me of a third remarkable story which happened in a small Argentinian village where an elderly woman was about to discover that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest problems. Story 3. Old Ilara and the Dry Well in a small Irish village named Willowbrook. Nestled amongst rolling green hills, dotted with sheep and sprawling fields of golden barley that stretched as far as the eye could see, lived a 72-year-old woman named Ilara. Her cottage was a traditional stone structure, whitewashed with a thatched roof that had weathered 50 harsh winters and scorching summers. Ilara was known and respected throughout the community of 200 families as the kindest, wisest, and most hard-working woman in the region. Whenever someone fell ill, she appeared at their door with a pot of nourishing broth and medicinal herbs gathered from her own garden. When children scraped their knees playing in the dirt lanes, they ran straight to her cottage, knowing they'd find clean bandages, comforting words, and sweet treats to dry their tears. Her small garden, meticulously cultivated for decades in a plot of just 20 square meters behind her cottage, was renowned throughout County Clare for producing the tastiest, most nutritious, and abundant vegetables anyone had ever tasted. Juicy red tomatoes the size of clenched fists, crisp, refreshing cucumbers, carrots sweet as honey, vibrant green cabbages, and fragrant herbs that perfumed the air at the slightest breeze. For exactly 40 years, since marrying the kind carpenter, Liam, and moving into that simple yet cozy cottage, Ilara had relied entirely on an old, trusty well in her backyard. It was a 15-meter deep well, hand-dug by her late husband when they were young newlyweds, full of hopes and dreams, providing crystal clear, abundant, and inexhaustible water for all the family's essential needs. The water from that well was truly special and unique. It had a sweeter, purer taste than any other water source within a 50-kilometer radius, as if filtered through underground layers of precious crystals and minerals. Neighbors often remarked, half jokingly, half seriously, that the water possessed almost magical properties. Plants watered with that water grew more vigorously and were resistant to pests and diseases. Food cooked with it tasted inexplicably more flavorful and aromatic. The rice prepared with that water was fluffier and more fragrant. Even simple herbal tea brewed with that special water had a more delicate aroma and a more complex flavor that charmed all visitors. For 4 entire decades, Ilara had developed a sacred and comforting morning routine. She woke every morning precisely when the first golden rays of sun began to filter through the white cotton curtains of her bedroom window. She donned her navy blue silk robe embroidered with willow blossoms, a wedding gift from her mother, slipped on her padded fabric slippers, and went down to the yard to fetch fresh water to prepare her morning tea, as she had religiously done every day for decades. But on a particular Monday morning in early May, when the willow blossoms had already fallen, giving way to small green fruits promising future abundance, Ilara went down to the yard, carrying her polished wooden bucket, as always, but discovered something that left her completely shocked and desperate. The well was completely, utterly, inexplicably dry. There wasn't a single drop of water at the bottom that had always been covered by at least 2 meters of crystal clear water, only dry, cracked earth, a few gray stones faintly gleaming in the deep darkness, and the empty echo of her voice when she shouted "hello" to test if there was water at a lower level. Ilara lowered and raised the rope with the wooden bucket several times in a row, with increasingly frantic and desperate movements, thinking that perhaps there was some inexplicable mistake, some optical illusion, some logical and simple explanation for this seemingly impossible situation. But there was no mistake. 40 whole years of reliable and inexhaustible water abundance had ended abruptly overnight, without any prior warning, alert signal, or apparent explanation that her mind could comprehend. How am I going to water my garden during the hot summer months that are coming? She murmured to herself aloud, looking with growing anxiety and panic at the organized and carefully planned rows of young tomatoes, growing cucumbers, sprouting carrots, verdant cabbages, and aromatic herbs that depended on abundant daily watering to survive the intense heat approaching. How am I going to cook my meals? How am I going to wash my clothes and keep the house clean? How am I going to bathe? How am I going to prepare tea to receive visitors? How am I simply going to survive without water at home? Ilara had very limited and carefully saved savings, only a few silver and copper coins meticulously saved over years and kept in an old tea tin buried under a loose floorboard in her bedroom for extreme emergencies, like serious illnesses or urgent house repairs. Hiring specialized workers to dig a new deep well would cost a real fortune, at least 50 silver coins, an astronomical sum that she simply didn't possess and wouldn't be able to obtain, even by selling all her few valuable possessions. The nearest public water source in the village was a considerable distance of more than 2 kilometers from her house. Following a dusty dirt road that went up and down steep hills, it was a long, tiring, and extremely difficult walk for a 72-year-old woman with arthritic joints and limited strength, especially when she would have to make this journey carrying heavy buckets full of water on the way back. For the next 5 days, Ilara had no choice but to make this strenuous and painful walk twice a day, every day. She woke up an hour earlier than usual, when the air was still fresh and the sun hadn't started to scorch, mentally prepared herself for the effort that awaited her, and slowly walked along the dusty and uneven roads, carrying 2 empty wooden buckets that already weighed considerably even without water. The one-way trip took 45 minutes, at a steady but slow pace, suitable for her physical limitations. At the public fountain, a community well surrounded by worn stones, and a rusty but functional hand pump, she carefully filled her 2 buckets with water, which, although clean and potable, did not possess the special flavor and crystalline purity of her private well. The return trip home was a true martyrdom that tested all the limits of her physical endurance and mental determination. The full buckets weighed at least 15 kilos each, forcing her elderly and trembling arms to bear a weight that made her muscles burn with pain and her hands develop painful blisters even through thick fabric gloves. She had to stop to rest every 200 meters, placing the buckets on the ground and massaging her aching hands and trembling arms that felt like melted lead. The return journey took more than an hour, leaving her completely exhausted, with backaches radiating to her legs and a sense of discouragement that grew every day. Worse still, the total amount of water she could carry in 2 daily trips, about 40 liters at most, was only enough for the most basic and urgent human needs: drinking, cooking a simple meal, and minimal hygiene. There was absolutely nothing left to water her precious garden that had been her source of pride, joy, and nutritious sustenance for decades. By the end of the first week of this torturous routine, Ilara was physically exhausted and emotionally devastated. Her hands were covered in open, bleeding blisters despite the gloves. Her back ached constantly, keeping her awake at night with sharp stabs that felt like knives piercing her spine. Her legs trembled with weakness and accumulated fatigue. Even more painful was watching her beloved garden, visibly and inexorably, wither day after day under the relentless May sun. The vibrant green leaves gradually turned yellow, then brown, then fell to the dry ground. The young tomatoes withered before ripening. The cucumbers stopped growing and began to wrinkle. The aromatic herbs lost their characteristic fragrance and became dry straw. Perhaps it's time to accept reality and give up the garden permanently, she thought sadly, sitting on her worn wooden porch on the hot, stuffy afternoon of the 10th day, watching with a broken heart her plants suffer and die slowly. Perhaps I'm too old and too weak to continue fighting the problems and challenges of life. Perhaps I should sell this house and move to the city to live with my niece, Aoife, and accept that my independent life has come to an end. It was precisely on that melancholy Wednesday afternoon, when Ilara was at her lowest point of despair and discouragement, that her closest and dearest neighbor, 20-year-old young Finn, appeared at her carved wooden door with a genuinely worried expression on his honest and kind face. Finn was a hard-working and respectful young man who lived just 100 meters away with his pregnant wife, Sours. He worked as a farmer on a barley farm a few kilometers from the village, woke up before dawn every day, and always treated Ilara with the affection and respect he would dedicate to his own dear grandmother. Aunt Ilara, he said respectfully, using the affectionate title that everyone in the village used to address her as a sign of genuine affection and deep respect. I heard from other neighbors that your well dried up more than a week ago. This must be extremely difficult and tiring for you. I'm very worried about your situation. It's true, my dear Finn, she replied with a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her 72 years. I really don't know what to do anymore, or how to solve this impossible situation. Perhaps the inevitable time has come to accept that I can no longer live independently, and move to the city to live with my niece and depend on the charity of relatives. Actually, Aunt Ilara, said Finn, with a warm and mysterious smile that completely lit up his young face, I came here specifically to make a proposal that can completely solve your problem. I can dig a new well for you, using my own tools and my own work, completely free of charge. Ilara looked at him with genuine surprise and disbelief. That's incredibly generous of you, Finn. But I can't accept such an extraordinary and valuable favor without offering adequate payment. A new well is worth a fortune, and you would work for weeks. How could I repay such a gift without feeling eternally indebted? Well, said the young man, scratching his head shyly and looking down at the ground with characteristic modesty, actually there's one very important thing that you could teach me in return, if you agreed. What would that be? Tell me, and I'll do everything in my power. My wife Sowers is pregnant with our first child, he explained with a mixture of radiant joy and visible anxiety, and we are both genuinely terrified of not knowing how to properly care for a newborn baby and how to raise a child so that he becomes a good, wise, and happy person. You raised 3 absolutely wonderful children who are respected and admired throughout the county for their intelligence, kindness, and exemplary character. Could you teach us all your secrets about child care, baby care, and how to shape a child's character? Ilara felt warm tears of gratitude and emotion welling up instantly in her tired eyes. Her throat closed with emotion, and for a few moments she couldn't utter a word. Oh, my dear Finn, she finally managed to say in a choked voice, it would be an extraordinary honor and an immense privilege to share absolutely everything I've learned during a lifetime about childcare and education. But you don't need to dig a hole, well, and work for weeks in exchange for some simple conversations. That would be completely disproportionate. Aunt Ilara, said Finn, with a deep and mature seriousness that contrasted with his young age, with all due respect, you don't understand the true value of what you're offering. My conversations with you about how to educate and care for my son will be worth infinitely more than any amount of money or physical work. A well provides clean water for a few decades, but your wise teachings on childcare will positively influence entire generations of my family for centuries. My son, his children, and his grandchildren will benefit from the wisdom you will share with us. Finn began the arduous work of digging the new well the next morning, shortly after sunrise, when the air was still, fresh, and suitable for intense physical work. He brought his strongest tools, forged iron shovels, sharp picks, leather buckets to remove earth, and thick ropes to safely descend into the increasingly deep excavation. But something completely extraordinary and totally unexpected began to happen that neither of them had foreseen or imagined in their original plans. When other villagers heard through the informal community communication network that Finn was digging a well for Ela, they spontaneously began to appear at her cottage, offering different kinds of voluntary help, each bringing a unique and valuable contribution to the project. First came the blacksmith, Kiran, a robust 40-year-old man with enormous hands calloused by decades of working with hot iron and intense fire. He offered not only his strongest and most specialized tools, but also his invaluable expertise in locating underground water veins using traditional techniques passed down through generations of blacksmiths. Aunt Amelia, Chen said with touching sincerity, removing his leather hat as a sign of respect, "You taught me how to prepare that special medicinal herb tea when my mother was gravely ill with a high fever last winter. I was desperate because the city doctors couldn't help her, but your tea cured her completely in just 3 days. She made a full recovery and lived 2 more healthy years thanks to you. Let me help with this, well, as a small way of showing My eternal gratitude. Then came the entire Rodriguez family, father, mother, and 2 strong and willing teenage sons, offering organized work shifts to significantly speed up the excavation and reduce the strain on any individual. Aunt Amelia, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her eyes shining with emotion, when our youngest son, Miguel Rodriguez, broke his leg in 3 places last winter, falling from a tree, you cared for him every day for 2 weeks, while I needed to work in the fields to ensure our survival. You fed him, gave him home remedies, talked to him so he wouldn't get depressed, and even taught him basic reading and writing lessons. We could never adequately repay that extraordinary kindness, but now we have an opportunity. Next appeared young scholar Javier, a bright 25-year-old who had secured a rare university education in the provincial capital. He offered his modern knowledge of hydraulic engineering, basic geology, and advanced well construction techniques he had learned in his formal studies. Aunt Amelia, Javier, explained with deep gratitude, when I was a small child and my parents were going through a period of extreme poverty where they could barely feed me properly, you always found creative excuses to give me extra vegetables from your garden. You'd say you had mistakenly planted too many, or that some tomatoes were ripening too quickly, or that you needed someone to test a new recipe. Without that secret supplemental nutrition, I never would have had enough energy to study properly and achieve my life-changing education. One by one, as if an invisible magnetic force drew them, almost all the 200 families of the village appeared during the following days, offering some kind of voluntary contribution, specialized physical labor, professional tools, traditional or modern technical knowledge, nutritious food to feed the volunteer workers, tea and fresh water to keep everyone hydrated, or simply moral encouragement, cheerful company, and funny stories to keep spirits high during the arduous work. What had begun as a modest week-long project quickly transformed into a spontaneous 5-day community celebration that brought the entire village together in a spirit of collaboration, joy, and common purpose that no one had experienced in many years. People worked with genuine enthusiasm during the day, digging earth, organizing stones, carefully building the circular walls of the well with traditional techniques that would ensure stability for decades, and gathered every night to share abundant community meals and touching stories in Maylin's small but welcoming house. On the blessed 5th day, when they finally found an abundant and crystalline underground water vein at exactly 14 meters deep, the entire village celebrated with a spontaneous feast as if it were the most important New Year's festival of their lives. The water that gushed from the new well was even clearer, purer, and sweeter than that of the old well, as if the earth wanted to reward that extraordinary display of community love. But the truly transformative surprise came when the village's respected elder, the 85-year-old wise master Kenjo, who was consulted by everyone on important matters and difficult decisions, asked to speak privately with Amelia at the end of the celebration. "Dear Amelia," he said with a deeply wise smile that seemed to carry the understanding of 8 decades of careful observation of human nature, "do you clearly understand what really happened here during these extraordinary 5 days? I gained a new and more abundant well, thanks to the absolutely extraordinary generosity of our wonderful neighbors." She replied sincerely. "No, my dear friend," Kensho said with paternal kindness, shaking his gray head slowly, "you discovered something infinitely more valuable and lasting than any physical well could ever be." "What do you mean, Master?" "For 40 whole years, you sincerely believed that you depended on that old 15-meter deep well to survive and thrive. But when it completely dried up, and you thought you were facing a catastrophe, you discovered a profound truth that was always there, but remained invisible. In reality, you always depended on something much deeper, more abundant, and more lasting than any physical water source. You depended on the infinite well of love, gratitude, respect, and genuine human connections that you patiently dug into the heart of this entire community through 40 years of small but constant kindness, silent but real generosity, and loving but discreet care for every person who crossed your path. The physical water well may dry up again in the future, the wise elder continued, but the well of loving relationships and mutual gratitude that you built during a lifetime of generous and selfless service will never run dry. On the contrary, it becomes deeper and more abundant with each act of kindness, each word of encouragement, each gesture of genuine care that you offer the world. Amelia then understood, with a crystalline clarity that illuminated every cell of her being, that the drying up of her well had not been a devastating tragedy. It had been a gift disguised as hardship, an extraordinary gift that allowed her to discover and directly experience the infinite abundance that had always been available around her, but which she had never fully perceived while focusing only on the limited and temporary water source in her backyard. The deepest and inexhaustible well, concluded Master Kensho with a wisdom that seemed to echo through the centuries, is always the well of genuine compassion and selfless love, and that well never runs dry, because the more you draw from it to give generously to others, the more pure and fresh water naturally springs from its infinite depths. Today, when you face an unexpected difficulty, a painful loss, or a problem that seems impossible to solve, perhaps the sudden loss of a job that seemed secure, a serious health problem that shakes your confidence, a deep disappointment in relationships that breaks your heart, remember Amelia's dry well fondly. Sometimes what seems to be scarcity, a problem, or tragedy, is actually a disguised invitation to discover deeper, more lasting, and more satisfying sources of abundance that have always been available around you, but which remained invisible and unused while we depended exclusively on the most obvious, superficial, and temporary resources. Story 4. The Ungrateful Disciple, Matteo, and Master Lorenzo, in the majestic monastery of San Pedro de Atacama, nestled in the breathtaking Andean foothills of northern Chile, where the air is so crisp it seems to cleanse not just the lungs, but the very soul, lived a novice named Matteo. He had arrived at the monastery 2 years prior, hailing from an impoverished family of farmers who eked out a living cultivating meager crops in the arid, sun-baked lands surrounding the Atacama Desert. Matteo's life before the monastery was one of constant hardship and struggle. His family owned a small, dilapidated adobe house, a few scrawny goats, and little more than the clothes on their backs. During the scorching summers, which lasted for months, they often went days without proper food, surviving on thin maize porridge and scarce water rations. The winters, though shorter, brought biting winds and freezing nights. When Matteo turned 17, his father, Ricardo, made a courageous yet agonizing decision. During a pilgrimage to the monastery for blessings during the Fiesta de la Virgen del Carmen, he approached the abbot with a desperate plea. "Venerable Master," Ricardo said, tears welling in his eyes as he knelt before the altar adorned with intricate silverwork, "my son Matteo is bright and possesses a pure heart, but our family is so impoverished we cannot provide him with adequate sustenance, education, or a hopeful future. I implore you to accept my son as a novice in the monastery so that he may have regular meals, safe shelter, spiritual guidance, and a life filled with purpose and meaning. The abbot, a wise man of 60 years named Lorenzo, who had dedicated his adult life to cultivating compassion and wisdom, looked deeply into young Matteo's eyes. He saw there a sharp intellect, a genuine spiritual curiosity, but also a hardness born of deprivation that could be both a strength and an obstacle on the spiritual path. "I accept your son as a disciple," Master Lorenzo declared solemnly, "but on one important condition. He must understand that monastic life is not an escape from hardship, but a path to transform hardship into wisdom and suffering into compassion." During his first months at the monastery, Matteo was genuinely amazed by his new life. He had a small but clean and well-lit cell with a comfortable cot instead of sleeping on the cold, hard ground. He received 3 meals a day, simple but nutritious and consistent, something he had never experienced in his previous life. He had access to sacred texts, profound teachings, and the company of dedicated fellow novices. But gradually, as the novelty of relative abundance wore off and he grew accustomed to his new standard of living, a troubling shift began to take place in young Matteo's mind. Instead of maintaining a deep gratitude for the extraordinary transformation of his circumstances, he began to take everything for granted and to find fault with increasingly minor aspects of his daily life. "The quinoa stew is too bland today," he would complain during communal meals, completely forgetting that 2 years prior he often went days without any solid food. "My cell is too small and stuffy," he'd mutter to other novices, erasing from his memory the nights he had slept in the open under the harsh desert sky. "The prayers are too long and repetitive," he'd sigh during spiritual practices, ignoring that, before arriving at the monastery, he had never had the opportunity to cultivate his mind through ancient contemplative techniques. "The scriptures are too difficult and abstract," he'd complain during his studies, forgetting that he came from a family where no one could read a single word. Master Lorenzo observed this gradual transformation with a mixture of compassionate sadness and pedagogical concern. He had witnessed this pattern repeated over decades, young men arriving at the monastery from difficult circumstances, initially filled with gratitude, but gradually developing a spiritual amnesia about their origins and coming to view their present blessings as entitlements rather than precious gifts. After silently observing for several months, Master Lorenzo decided it was time for an instructive intervention that might awaken Matteo from his growing ingratitude before it solidified into a permanent character flaw. It was a chilly morning in July, when the wind whistled through the Andean peaks like ancestral voices chanting unseen mantras, that Master Lorenzo summoned Matteo for a private conversation in his quarters. The master's room was simple yet inviting, with colorful Chilean rugs on the floor, a small, intricately carved wooden statue of the Virgin Mary on a dark wooden table, and a window offering a panoramic view of the snow-capped Andes stretching to the infinite horizon. "Matteo," the master said calmly, pouring warm mate into 2 hand-painted ceramic mugs, "I have observed your adaptation to monastic life during these 2 years, and I've noticed some trends that deeply concern me." "What trends, Master?" Matteo asked with a slightly defensive expression, suspecting he was about to receive some form of reprimand. "You have been complaining increasingly frequently about aspects of life in the monastery," Lorenzo explained patiently. "Food, accommodations, studies, spiritual practices. It's as if you've completely forgotten where you came from and what your life was like before you arrived here." "But Master," Matteo protested with youthful petulance, Surely, I have the right to express my opinion when things are not up to the standards we should expect from a respectable monastery. Master Lorenzo fell silent for a long moment, studying Matteo's young face with deep eyes that seemed to read not only his words, but also the patterns of thought and emotion that moved like clouds across his immature mind. "Matteo," he finally said, "I would like to conduct an instructive experiment with you. If you agree, it could be one of the most valuable lessons of your spiritual life. If you refuse, I will respect your choice, but you will miss a unique opportunity for genuine growth." "What kind of experiment?" Matteo asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his defensiveness. "I want you to spend exactly 3 days living in the same conditions you lived in during your childhood, before coming to the monastery. 3 full days, eating only what your family ate, sleeping as they slept, and facing the same deprivations they faced daily." "That seems unnecessary and somewhat cruel," Matteo responded immediately. "Why should I voluntarily submit myself to needless suffering?" "Because," Master Lorenzo said with a wisdom that seemed to echo through decades of experience with young disciples, "only when we clearly remember where we came from can we truly appreciate where we are. And only when we truly appreciate where we are can we properly proceed to where we should go." After much hesitation and internal resistance, Matteo reluctantly agreed to the experiment, mainly because he didn't want to appear cowardly or disrespectful in front of his master. The experiment began on a cold Monday in July. Master Lorenzo accompanied Matteo to a small, abandoned adobe hut a couple of kilometers from the monastery, originally built as temporary shelter for shepherds during sandstorms. The hut had thick, crumbling adobe walls, a leaky roof, no heating whatsoever, and only a small opening that served as both door and window. "For the next 3 days," the master explained, "you will sleep in this hut on the cold stone floor, covered only with this thin woolen blanket similar to what your family possessed. You will eat only what is in this bag, a small handful of dried maize each day, and diluted mate made with rainwater collected in a clay pot." Matteo looked at the dark, cold interior of the hut, then at the meager amount of food that was supposed to last 3 whole days, and felt for the first time a genuine pang of anxiety in his stomach. "Master," he said, trying to maintain a confident tone of voice, "this is exactly how I used to live. It shouldn't be a problem at all." "We shall see," Lorenzo replied simply, before departing back to the monastery, leaving Matteo alone with his memories and his choices. The first night was a shocking revelation for Matteo. The penetrating chill of the stones beneath his body seemed to suck all the warmth from his bones. The thin blanket offered minimal protection against the icy wind that whistled through the cracks in the walls. He had completely forgotten what it was like to try to sleep when every muscle in the body is tense with cold, when the feet become numb, and when the empty stomach produces strange sounds that echo in the darkness. "It should be easier tomorrow," he muttered to himself, shivering uncontrollably under the inadequate blanket. "I'll get used to it again quickly." But the second night was even worse. Without adequate food, his body had less energy to generate internal heat. His hands were so cold he could barely hold the cup of diluted mate. His mind, deprived of the regular nourishment to which it had become accustomed, functioned more slowly and confusedly. He began to remember viscerally aspects of his childhood that he had completely forgotten or romanticized in his memory. He remembered the mornings when he woke up with a stomach aching from hunger, but there was no food available until the end of the day. He remembered nights when he cried silently from cold, huddled against the body of his mother, who also shivered under insufficient blankets. He remembered the constant feeling of uncertainty about when the next proper meal would be. But it was during the third night that the true transformation occurred. Matteo was lying on the stone floor, too weak from hunger to shiver, too cold to sleep, when he heard footsteps approaching the hut. Initially, he thought it was his imagination affected by deprivation, but then a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Master Lorenzo, carrying an oil lamp that cast a dancing, golden light on the rough walls of the hut. "How are you feeling, Matteo?" the master asked gently, sitting down on the cold floor beside his disciple. "Master," Matteo said in a weak but profoundly emotional voice he hadn't felt in months, "I had completely forgotten. I had forgotten what it was like to feel real cold, real hunger, real uncertainty. In the monastery, when I complain that the stew is bland, I forget that. During my childhood, there was often no stew at all. When I complain that my cell is small, I forget that I used to sleep in the open under sandstorms." "Go on," the master encouraged softly. "When I complain that the prayers are long, I forget that before I never had the opportunity to develop my mind in any way. When I complain that the scriptures are difficult, I forget that I come from a family where no one could read a single word. Every single thing I complain about in the monastery is, in fact, an extraordinary luxury that most people in the world have never had the chance to experience." Tears began to stream down Matteo's gaunt cheeks as he continued his spontaneous confession. "Master, I spent 2 whole years being ungrateful for daily miracles. I have regular food 3 times a day, that's a miracle. I have a warm and safe place to sleep, that's a miracle. I have access to the deepest teachings of humanity, that's a miracle. I have the guidance of wise masters like you, that's a miracle. How could I have been so blind to my own extraordinary abundance?" Master Lorenzo smiled with a paternal tenderness that completely transformed his austere face. "Matteo," he said, "what you are experiencing now is true spiritual awakening. It's not just an intellectual understanding, but a visceral and emotional recognition of the abundance that has always been present, but which became invisible due to habit and familiarity. But how can I guarantee that I will never forget this lesson?" Matteo asked anxiously. "How can I keep this gratitude alive when I return to the normal life of the monastery?" "Through a very simple, daily practice," the master replied. "Every morning, before getting out of bed, you will dedicate 5 minutes to consciously remembering 3 specific things: what your life was like before the monastery, what you have available today that you didn't have before, and how these present blessings are precious gifts and not guaranteed rights. And every night, before going to sleep, you will dedicate another 5 minutes to consciously giving thanks for 3 specific experiences of the day that you could easily have taken for granted: the food you ate, the roof that sheltered you, the teachings you received, the conversations you had, or simply the opportunity to be alive and conscious in a healthy body." In the following months, Matteo was completely transformed. His constant complaints disappeared and were replaced by frequent expressions of genuine gratitude. He became known in the monastery as the most appreciative and joyful disciple, always willing to help other novices, always finding positive aspects, even in the most mundane and challenging tasks. Other novices frequently asked about the secret of his transformation, and Matteo always responded the same way: "Remembering where I came from taught me to value where I am, and valuing where I am gives me energy and joy to continue growing towards where I should go." Years later, when Matteo himself became a respected master, he continued the daily practice of gratitude he had learned in that cold hut, and whenever he received new disciples from difficult circumstances, he led them through the same transformative experiment, knowing that only through the conscious remembrance of past hardships can we truly appreciate present blessings. Gratitude, he used to teach his own disciples, decades later, is not merely a pleasant feeling. It's a form of perception that reveals the hidden abundance always surrounding us, yet becomes invisible when we cease to consciously pay attention to the extraordinary ordinariness of being alive in a universe that constantly conspires to sustain and nourish us. Today, when you find yourself complaining about aspects of your life you deem inadequate or unsatisfactory, perhaps the slow traffic on your commute to work, the bland-tasting meal, the apartment feeling too cramped, or relationships seeming insufficiently fulfilling, remember Dawood's frozen hut. Take a few moments to consciously consider how your current life would compare to the circumstances of billions of people throughout human history who never had access to a fraction of the comforts, opportunities, and abundances you consider normal and guaranteed. The practice of conscious gratitude isn't about settling for less or ceasing to strive for growth and improvement. It's about recognizing and appreciating the extraordinary value of what's already present, so we can build from a foundation of acknowledged abundance instead of a false perception of scarcity and deprivation. And this discovery of how memory can both obscure and illuminate our perception of abundance reminds me of a fifth poignant tale, one that unfolded in a quiet forest where an extraordinary tree grew, unseen by all. Story 5, The Unseen Oak. In the rolling hills of County Kerry, Ireland, nestled amongst ancient moss-draped oaks and whispering willows that formed natural cathedrals of dappled sunlight and sacred stillness, lay the tranquil monastery of Glencorn Abbey, meaning Valley of the Clear Spring. Founded over 4 centuries ago by monks seeking a place for deep meditation, far from the clamor of the outside world, the abbey's history was interwoven with the land itself. The meticulously tended gardens, with their winding, flagstone paths and serene ponds mirroring the ever-changing sky, boasted a rich variety of trees, vibrant fuchsia rhododendrons exploding into bloom in spring, golden sycamores ablaze with autumnal hues, evergreens whispering ancient secrets in the breeze, and willows gracefully swaying, even in the gentlest zephyr. Yet, one tree held a unique and extraordinary presence, though seemingly unnoticed, a majestic Irish oak, over 200 years old, standing at the heart of the main garden. Its trunk was so wide that it would take at least 6 adults with outstretched arms to encircle it completely. This ancient tree possessed truly remarkable qualities. Its branches spread in perfectly symmetrical patterns, creating a dense canopy offering cooling shade during scorching summers and shelter during the autumnal downpours. Its roots, deep and far-reaching, prevented erosion along that section of the hillside. Its leaves transformed with spectacular beauty, each season a natural spectacle capable of inspiring poets for generations. More impressively, this particular oak possessed an almost magical quality. Birds of countless species built their nests in its sturdy branches, creating a natural symphony of melodious songs that began before dawn and continued long after sunset. Playful squirrels spiraled up its trunk in joyous patterns. Colorful butterflies clustered amongst its spring blossoms like tiny dancing rainbows. It was as if all the wildlife of the region intuitively recognized the tree as a special center of life force and natural harmony. In autumn, its golden leaves fell gently like precious coins, creating a breathtaking carpet around its base. In spring, as the first tender green leaves unfurled, the tree seemed to radiate renewed energy, palpable to anyone sensitive enough to feel its presence. The most astonishing aspect, however, was that despite its extraordinary qualities and prominent location, none of the monks seemed to ever comment on the tree, consciously notice it, or show any appreciation for its beauty and importance to the ecosystem. They passed it dozens of times a day, moving between the monastery buildings. They sat on nearby benches for hours of meditation. They slowly walked around it during their walking meditations. They diligently swept the leaves that fell from its branches. Yet, the tree was seemingly invisible to their consciousness, a constant and familiar presence that had become part of the background landscape, unworthy of attention or conscious acknowledgement. For 8 years, this peculiar situation continued unchanged. The oak grew silently, offering its generous gifts each season, sheltering countless creatures, purifying the air they breathed, and remaining a central element of the monastery's natural beauty, while remaining essentially invisible to those who benefited most from its constant presence. It was in the 9th year that a young visiting monk, 25-year-old brother Awaken, arrived at the abbey from a bustling urban temple in Dublin, where he had spent 5 years studying Buddhist sutras amidst the constant chaos of traffic, construction, and hurried crowds. Awaken had requested to spend 3 months at Glencorn Abbey, specifically because he longed for silence, nature, and the opportunity to deepen his meditative practice in a tranquil and inspiring environment. The morning after his arrival, as Awaken left his simple cell to explore the abbey gardens in the first golden rays of sunlight filtering through the morning mist, he stopped abruptly. His eyes fell upon the majestic oak at the heart of the main garden. "My God," he murmured to himself, "such an extraordinary tree. How is it possible that something so magnificent exists in this place?" Awaken slowly approached the tree, as if entering a sacred cathedral, unwilling to disturb the sanctity of the moment. He walked completely around its massive trunk, observing every detail, the rich, complex texture of its bark, telling the story of 2 centuries of patient growth, the intricate patterns of branches intertwined like a 3-dimensional mandala, the abundant life constantly moving amongst the leaves in the form of birds, insects, and small mammals. This tree must be over 200 years old, he thought, mentally calculating based on the trunk's impressive diameter. It was here long before any of the current abbey buildings. It has witnessed generations of monks, hundreds of seasons, decades of climatic changes and historical events. It's like a living library of natural wisdom. Awaken sat at the base of the tree, his back against its smooth, warm bark, and closed his eyes to meditate. Immediately, he felt something he had never experienced before in years of meditative practice, a profound sensation of being supported, not only physically, but energetically, by the ancient tree's solid and serene presence. It's as if this tree is a silent Zen master, he thought, offering teachings through its own patient and generous existence, without needing words or concepts. After an hour of deep and invigorating meditation, Awaken opened his eyes and decided to find other monks to ask about the extraordinary tree's history and significance. Surely such an impressive presence should be an important focus of the monasteries. Spiritual life, perhaps even considered sacred or especially revered by the community. He encountered Brother Liam, sweeping dried leaves near the meditation pavilion. Brother Liam, Awaken said with genuine enthusiasm, that magnificent tree in the center of the garden, How long has it been there? Does it hold any special meaning for the monastery community? Liam stopped sweeping and looked in the direction Aoden was pointing, with a slightly confused expression. Tree? He asked, frowning, as if trying to understand what Aoden was talking about. Oh, you mean the old oak? Yes, it's always been there, I suppose. Never really thought much about it, to be honest. It's just part of the landscape, you know. Aoden was surprised by the casual and seemingly disinterested response. He tried again with another monk, Brother Finian, who was working in the vegetable garden. Brother Finian, he said, that incredible central tree, have you ever reflected on its age, its beauty, or how it contributes to the spiritual atmosphere of this place? Finian glanced briefly towards the tree, then back to his rows of cabbages. Tree, he replied absently. Yeah, there's a tree there. It sheds a lot of leaves that we have to constantly sweep. Sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be more practical to remove it to make garden maintenance easier. Aoden was almost shocked by this response. How could anyone see that majestic tree merely as a maintenance inconvenience? Over the following days, Aoden discreetly asked all 15 resident monks about the tree. The responses were consistently similar. No one seemed to truly see it, appreciate it, or consider it significant in any way. To them, it was simply part of the monastery's landscape, furniture, as commonplace and irrelevant as the paving stones or the roof tiles. How is it possible? Aoden wondered each morning as he sat beneath the tree for his daily meditation. How can people who have dedicated their lives to cultivating mindfulness and appreciation be so completely blind to a natural miracle that is literally right in front of their eyes every day? It was during his third week at the abbey that Aoden decided to directly address the abbot superior, the venerable master, Chirin, a 70-year-old man known for his profound wisdom and keen perception of spiritual subtleties that others often missed. Master Siaran, Aoden said respectfully during a private meeting in the abbot's austere yet elegant office, may I ask a question that may seem strange? Certainly, young Aoden. Strange questions often lead to the most important discoveries. There's an extraordinary tree in the center of the main garden, an oak over 200 years old that is truly magnificent. But I've noticed that none of the resident monks seem to notice or consciously appreciate it. How is this possible in a community dedicated to cultivating mindfulness? Master Chirin was silent for a long moment, looking out the window towards the garden where the tree in question could be clearly seen, its late autumn golden leaves glowing in the soft afternoon light. Aoden, the master finally said, you have just asked the most important question anyone has asked in this abbey in many years, and your observation reveals something profound about the nature of human perception that is fundamental to spiritual practice. What do you mean, Master? I will tell you a story that may answer your question, said Chiran, pouring hot green tea into 2 simple ceramic cups. A long time ago, a Zen master visited a monastery where the monks prided themselves on their meticulous attention to detail. They could perfectly recite sutras from memory, perform ceremonies with millimetric precision, and maintain the gardens in impeccable condition. The visiting master observed their practices for a week, then gathered all the monks and asked a simple question. How many steps are there on the staircase you climb every day to go to the meditation hall? None of the monks knew the answer, despite having climbed those steps thousands of times. They had become so focused on their routines and goals that they had stopped truly seeing what was constantly present. The tree you question, continued Master Chirin, represents something very profound about how familiarity can create a kind of spiritual blindness. When something is always present, our minds tend to categorize it as known and stop paying conscious attention. But doesn't that contradict the teachings on mindfulness? Aoden asked. On the contrary, the master replied with a wise smile. It perfectly illustrates why true mindfulness is so challenging and valuable. It's easy to pay attention to the new, the exotic, the obviously important, but to pay true attention to the familiar, the constant, the apparently commonplace, that requires a much deeper level of conscious presence. Our minds have a natural tendency to filter information they consider irrelevant or already known. This is a useful function in many contexts. It allows us to focus on changes and novelties that may be important for our survival. But it also means that we often become blind to the extraordinary beauty and constant gifts that surround us. Master Churin rose and walked to the window, looking directly at the majestic tree. This tree has been here throughout my life, in this abbey, 43 years. It has seen me arrive as an eager young novice, grow through decades of practice, face doubts and discoveries, and become a teacher. It has offered shade during scorching summers, shelter during storms, beauty throughout the seasons, and oxygen with every breath I have taken. But you are right, he continued with touching honesty. I had stopped truly seeing it. It had become so familiar that it had become invisible, and that is a powerful lesson about how many other gifts in our lives, people, opportunities, natural beauties, even our own breath and heartbeat, have become invisible due to familiarity. At that moment, Master Churin made a decision that would change the abbey's culture. Aoden, he said, would you like to help me with a special project? Let's create a new practice for our community, inspired by your insightful observation. The following week, Master Churin announced a new daily tradition for all the monks of the abbey. Every morning, immediately after the collective meditation, the entire community would gather in a circle around the central tree for a practice he called meditation of familiar presence. For 10 minutes, the master explained to the assembled community, we will practice truly seeing this tree that has been our silent companion for decades. We will observe its bark, its branches, the creatures that live in it, how the light plays amongst its leaves, how it subtly changes each day, how it has grown and evolved over the years. But more importantly, he continued, we will use this practice with the tree as training to truly see all the other familiar presences in our lives that have become invisible, each other, the food we eat, the air we breathe, the buildings that shelter us, and the countless gifts we receive each moment but have stopped noticing. The practice completely transformed the abbey's atmosphere. The monks began to see not only the tree with new eyes, but their entire environment with renewed appreciation. They noticed details in the architecture they had ignored for years. They began to truly hear the different songs of the birds that had always been there. They developed a deeper gratitude for the simple foods they ate daily. Even more significantly, they began to see one another more fully and appreciatively. Siblings who had lived together for decades discovered aspects of each other's personality and wisdom they'd never noticed before. Brother Thomas remained at the monastery for the planned 3 months, but the transformation he'd catalyzed continued long after his departure. The tree nobody saw became the central symbol of the monastery's teachings on mindful presence and appreciation of the familiar. Years later, when visiting monks arrived at the St. Jude's Abbey, the first thing the residents did was take them to see the central tree and tell its story. This tree, they explained, taught us that true mindfulness isn't about noticing new and exotic things. It's about seeing with fresh eyes what has always been present, but which our familiarity has rendered invisible. Today, when you pause to consider your own life, how many extraordinary trees stand right before your eyes every day, yet have become invisible due to familiarity? Perhaps it's the smile of a loved one you see daily but have stopped truly appreciating. Perhaps it's the view from your window containing natural beauties you haven't observed in months. Perhaps it's the extraordinary miracle of clean water flowing from a tap whenever you turn it on, or electricity appearing instantly when you flip a switch. The practice of the tree nobody saw can be applied to any aspect of your life. Spend 10 minutes a day consciously observing something you see regularly but have stopped truly noticing. It could be your own face in the mirror, the hands that tirelessly serve you each day, the food that nourishes your body, or the loved ones whose constant presence you may have begun to take for granted. True abundance doesn't come from acquiring new things. It comes from seeing with renewed clarity the extraordinary richness that is already present, but which our familiar mind has ceased to perceive. Story 6. Young Lily and the Glass of Water. In the quaint coastal town of Carmel, California, known for its charming art galleries and the serene beauty of Carmel Beach, lived a humble family in a cozy cottage. The family consisted of Mr. Garcia, a skilled carpenter of 42 years, who crafted exquisite furniture, his wife, Isabella, a kind elementary school teacher, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, a name as bright and pure as her spirit. The Garcia's cottage was simple, yet inviting, filled with the warm glow of sunlight filtering through lace curtains. A small, vibrant garden outside boasted colorful California poppies and a majestic redwood tree, a silent sentinel watching over their lives. It was a home where every item held its place, every daily ritual performed with a mindful attention that transformed simple tasks into acts of peaceful presence. At the serene Carmel Mission Basilica Museum, located a short 15-minute drive from the Garcia family home, lived Sister Rose, a 55-year-old woman who had dedicated over 30 years to studying the teachings of Christianity and practicing contemplative prayer. Sister Rose was renowned for her gentle wisdom, her ability to find spiritual depth in everyday life, and her unique skill in teaching children about Christian values through simple stories and engaging activities. Every Wednesday morning, for the past 2 years, little Lily had visited the museum for what she cheerfully called heart lessons with Sister Rose. These informal sessions began when Lily, then only 4, had wandered off during a local farmer's market and found herself in the quiet cloisters of the mission, where Sister Rose discovered her sitting by a fountain, earnestly conversing with the birds about her childhood worries. "Why are you so sad, little one?" Sister Rose had asked during that first encounter, gently kneeling beside the child. "I'm not sad," Lily replied with the direct honesty typical of young children. "I'm just talking to the birds about how sometimes grown-ups are too busy and forget to notice beautiful things. Birds are good listeners, and they always have time for important little things." Sister Rose was immediately captivated by the child's innate perceptiveness and, after reuniting Lily with her relieved parents, obtained permission to invite her for regular visits. "This child," she told the Garcia parents, "possesses an intuitive wisdom that can teach us as much as we can teach her." During those 2 years of weekly meetings, Sister Rose had consistently marveled at Lily's ability to find profound joy and spiritual meaning in the simplest, seemingly mundane experiences. The child could spend an entire hour observing a hummingbird hovering near a flower, not passively or bored, but with a complete and fascinated attention that few adults could maintain for more than a few minutes. Sister Rose, Lily had remarked on one memorable occasion, "Have you ever noticed how each petal of a California poppy has a slightly different pattern of veins? It's as if each one is a unique little person, even though it's part of the same flower. That means there are never two exactly alike beauties in the whole world." Observations like this had become characteristic of the encounters between the experienced sister and the wise child, forging an extraordinary friendship that transcended differences in age and life experience. It was a particularly warm Wednesday morning in late June, the California sun already hinting at the scorching summer months ahead, when Lily arrived at the museum for her weekly visit, carrying a small, brightly colored backpack, and with an expression of barely contained excitement shining in her dark, expressive eyes. "Sister Rose," she called cheerfully, as she spotted her adult friend sweeping fallen leaves in the courtyard. "I brought something very special to show you today." "What did you bring, little Lily?" Sister Rose asked, setting aside her broom and sitting cross-legged on the ground to be at eye level with the child, with careful, ceremonial movements that unconsciously mimicked the ritualistic practices she had observed at the museum. Lily opened her backpack and took out an object that made Sister Rose blink several times in confusion. It was simply a common glass, half filled with clear water. "It's a glass of water," Sister Rose said gently, trying to understand what could be special about such an ordinary object. "No," Lily replied, with a passionate intensity that surprised the sister. "It's not just a glass of water. You're only seeing the outside, but you're not really seeing what's inside." "What do you mean, child?" Sister Rose asked, intrigued by the little girl's fervor. "Sit here with me," Lily instructed, indicating a specific spot on the ground where the morning sunlight filtered through the leaves of a nearby tree in dancing patterns. "And look at the water, not quickly, but very, very slowly and carefully, like you taught me to look at the poppies." Sister Rose obeyed, adjusting her position to sit beside Lily and focusing her attention on the ordinary glass of water that the child held in her small hands as if it were a precious treasure. "Now," whispered Lily, with the seriousness of an experienced teacher, "I'll show you everything I see when I really look at this glass of water." The child tilted the glass slightly, allowing the sunlight to penetrate the water at different angles. "First," she said, her voice small but full of reverence, "see how the sunlight gets inside the water and makes tiny rainbows that dance. They aren't big rainbows like in the sky after the rain, but they're tiny rainbows that live in ordinary water every day, waiting for someone to notice them." Sister Rose looked more closely and, to her surprise, saw exactly what Lily was describing: small spectrums of colored light moving gently on the water's surface like microscopic liquid. "Jules, keep looking," Lily encouraged, moving the glass very slowly in different directions. "Now see how the water makes everything on the outside look different when you look through it. Your hand looks strangely curved. My finger looks broken in the middle. The tree over there looks wavy, as if it were made of jelly." Once again, Sister Rose observed carefully and confirmed the child's precise observations. The water was acting as a natural lens, refracting and distorting images in ways that created constantly shifting optical miracles. "But that's not the most special part yet," Lily continued, bringing the glass closer to her face until her breath created small ripples on the water's surface. "The most special part is thinking about all the journey this water took to get to this glass. What kind of journey? Sister Rose asked, completely absorbed now in the child's extraordinary perspective. Well, Lily said, closing her eyes as if visualizing an epic story. First, this water was living in the ocean where big whales swam through it and little fish played in it. Then the sun called it up to the clouds, where it flew through the sky like an invisible bird, seeing the whole world from above. Then it fell as rain on the mountains, where it ran over the rocks and made little waterfalls, singing songs that only the stones know. Then it went down the rivers, passing through forests where deer came to drink from it, and passing through fields where it helped flowers grow. And finally, Lily concluded, opening her eyes with an expression of genuine wonder, it arrived at our faucet, and now it's here in this glass, carrying memories of all the places it visited and all the creatures it helped during its long life. Sister Rose felt unexpected tears welling up in her eyes. In over 30 years of meditative practice and study of complex Christian scriptures, she had never considered a common glass of water with the depth and reverence that this 6-year-old child was naturally demonstrating. Lily, she said, with a voice slightly choked with emotion, where did you learn to see so much beauty and meaning in something so simple? I didn't learn it anywhere, the child replied with disconcerting simplicity. It's always been like this. I think grown-ups forget how to see because they get too busy thinking about complicated things. But if you stop and look, really not look quickly like when you're in a hurry, but look slowly like when you want to memorize the face of someone you love, then you see that nothing is simple. Everything is full of stories and magic and secret connections. Can I tell you a secret? Lily continued, lowering her voice as if about to share highly confidential information. Of course, dear, I do this with everything, Lily whispered conspiratorially. With my breakfast I see the fields where the wheat grew, and the people who worked to plant it, and the sun, and the rain that helped it grow big. With my pillow at night I think about the cotton that grew on plants, and the people who wove it, and how it will keep my dreams until morning. With people too, she added, looking directly into Sister Rose's eyes. When I look at you, I don't just see a nun. I see the little girl you were one day, and all the people who taught you things, and all the happy and sad moments that made you the kind person you are now. At that moment, Sister Rose understood that she was in the presence of something extraordinary. A child who had naturally developed what Christian teachings call compassionate seeing, the ability to see how all things are deeply interconnected and how even the most ordinary objects contain the entire universe within them. Lily, Sister Rose said carefully, would you like to teach other adults to see the way you see? Do they want to learn? The child asked, genuinely surprised. I thought adults already knew everything. No, little teacher, Sister Rose replied with a radiant smile. In fact, often the more we think we know, the less we truly see. You possess a kind of wisdom that many of us lose as we grow up, and it would be an extraordinary gift if you could help us find it again. In the following weeks, Sister Rose began to incorporate Lily's lessons into her own teachings for adult visitors to the museum. She created a new practice called the water glass contemplation, where she asked practitioners to spend 20 minutes mindfully observing a simple glass of water. Following the model Lily had demonstrated, the results were transformative. Adults who had practiced meditation for years discovered entirely new levels of presence and appreciation. Stressed executives wept as they contemplated the epic journey of the water. University professors had profound insights into cosmic interconnectedness. Busy parents developed a renewed ability to marvel at the small discoveries of their own children. This child, Sister Rose frequently explained to visitors, reminds us that enlightenment is not about acquiring complex knowledge or achieving altered states of consciousness. It's about recovering our natural ability to see the extraordinary magic that is present in every common moment, in every familiar object, in every ordinary experience of daily life. Lily, for her part, continued her weekly visits to the museum, always bringing new discoveries to share, how dewdrops create tiny perfect worlds in spiderwebs, how shadows of leaves dance in patterns that tell stories, how the sound of rain on the roof is actually a complex symphony with thousands of tiny instruments playing together. Years later, when Lily grew into a young woman, she never completely lost her ability to see miracles hidden in common experiences. And Sister Rose, who became one of the most respected Christian teachers in California, always credited a 6-year-old child and a common glass of water with teaching her the deepest lesson of her spiritual life. True spiritual practice, she often said in her lectures, is not about escaping the ordinary world. It's about seeing the ordinary world with uncommon eyes. It's about discovering that there is nothing ordinary, our habitual perception that renders the extraordinary invisible. Today, when you drink a glass of water, eat a simple meal, or look at any everyday object around, you remember little Lily and her natural wisdom. Allow yourself a few moments to truly contemplate what is before you, its history, its connections, its journey to reach your hands, and the physical and chemical miracles that make it possible. The practice of seeing with childlike eyes is not about becoming childish or naive. It's about recovering the ability to genuinely marvel at the extraordinary reality that is constantly present, but that our adult minds have learned to categorize as common or unimportant. Every glass of water you drink contains the history of the universe. Every breath you take connects you to all the plants that produce oxygen. Every food you eat carries the loving labor of countless people and the generosity of the earth. When you truly see this, not just understand it intellectually, but see it with an open heart, like Lily did, gratitude becomes as natural as breathing, and abundance reveals itself in every moment of ordinary life. And this discovery of how a child's perspective can reveal hidden depths in everyday experience reminds me of a seventh touching story, which took place in a quiet cove where a fisherman was about to learn that sometimes the greatest catches come when our nets are seemingly empty. Story 7. Fisherman Mateo and the Empty Net. In the calm, crystalline waters of the Bahia de Todos Santos, in Baja California Sur, Mexico, where the majestic Sierra de la Laguna mountains rise in the background, lived a 53-year-old fisherman named Mateo. He was a descendant of a fishing lineage dating back over 200 years, men and women whose lives had been entirely dedicated to the generous sea that provided sustenance for their families and coastal communities. Mateo owned a small, traditional wooden boat painted in vibrant blues and yellows, built by his own father decades ago, using techniques passed down through generations. The boat, named Esperanza, Eternal Hope, in carefully painted Spanish lettering on its side, was equipped with handcrafted fishing nets woven by Mateo's wife, Isabella, using patterns and techniques she had learned from her mother-in-law during their early years of marriage. For over 30 years, Mateo had followed the same sacred routine every day. He woke at 4 a.m., while the stars still shone in the dark sky, prepared his equipment with the meticulous care of a Zen monk, arranging his altar, and sailed to the open ocean as the first golden rays of sun touched the surface of the tranquil waters. Mateo knew those waters like a lover knows every expression on their beloved's face. He knew exactly where the different types of fish gathered during each season, where the underwater currents created ideal fishing conditions, and how to interpret the subtle signs, changes in the water's color, wave patterns, the movement of seagulls that indicated where abundant schools of fish were most likely to be found. His reputation in the coastal village of Todos Santos was impeccable. Other fishermen frequently sought his advice on fishing techniques, sea conditions, and the best spots to cast their nets. Fishmongers competed for his catches because they knew Mateo always brought the freshest and highest quality fish. His family had never wanted for anything, always having fresh fish on the table and enough income to live with dignity and even occasional small luxuries. But during the last 6 months, something completely inexplicable and deeply disturbing had begun to happen in Mateo's life. Despite following exactly the same techniques that had worked perfectly for 3 decades, despite fishing in the same productive locations he knew like the back of his hand, despite using the same reliable equipment and leaving at the same favorable hours, his nets were consistently returning empty. Not just with few fish, completely empty. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Mateo cast his carefully woven nets into the waters that had been generous throughout his adult life, waited patiently for the ideal time, and pulled them back to discover that they did not contain even a single small fish. It must be a temporary phase, he had told Isabella during the first month of this inexplicable situation. The ocean has its own rhythms and mysteries. Perhaps the fish have temporarily migrated to deeper waters, or perhaps there is some seasonal change that I don't yet fully understand. Perhaps it's a test of nature. Isabella had replied with the loving patience that characterized her gentle personality. You have always been blessed with abundance. Perhaps this is a time to develop different virtues, patience, humility, faith in providence. But as the months passed and the situation showed no signs of improvement, Mateo's frustration and anxiety began to intensify dangerously. His savings were rapidly dwindling. He had begun to go into debt with fuel suppliers for the boat and with local merchants to keep food on the table. Other fishermen whispered among themselves about his extraordinary run of bad luck, some suggesting that perhaps he was being punished for some unknown sin or ancestral curse. I don't understand what's happening, Mateo confessed to his wife on a particularly difficult night, sitting at the dinner table, facing a plate of simple rice and beans that constituted a much more modest meal than those they were accustomed to. I'm doing exactly everything the same way I always have. I'm using the same methods my father taught me, that worked for my grandfather, that worked for generations of our family. Why suddenly do they no longer work? Perhaps, Isabella gently suggested, it's time to seek guidance from someone who can see this situation from a different perspective. How about visiting Maestro Domingo at the mountain temple? He is known for his wisdom on finding meaning in times of difficulty. Maestro Domingo was a respected 70-year-old Zen monk who lived in a small temple built on the wooded slopes of the mountain that rose behind the coastal village. He was sought out by people from all over the region when they faced seemingly unsolvable problems or needed spiritual perspective on life's challenges. Domingo had been a fisherman in his youth before becoming a monk, so he intimately understood the rhythms and challenges of maritime life. The following Sunday, Mateo made the 1-hour hike through mountain trails, covered with ancient pines, until he reached the simple yet elegant temple where Maestro Domingo resided alone. Dedicating his days to meditation, the study of sacred texts, and spiritual guidance for visitors seeking wisdom, Maestro Domingo Mateo said, after being warmly welcomed and invited to sit on soft tatami mats in front of a simple altar decorated with aromatic incense and a small statue of Buddha in a meditation position. I come seeking your guidance on a situation I cannot understand, and that is threatening to destroy everything I have built during my entire life. Matteo recounted his entire story in detail, his family lineage of successful fishermen, his 30 years of constant abundance, the recent 6 months of consistently empty nets despite all his experienced efforts, and his growing despair about the future. Maestro, he concluded, his voice choked with emotion, I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything I know, visited all the locations that have always been productive, used all the techniques I've learned over decades, but it's as if the ocean has decided to abandon me completely. How can I continue to be a fisherman if I can't catch any fish? Maestro Domingo remained silent for several minutes, looking through the open window of the temple towards the distant ocean that shimmered like liquid silver under the soft light of the afternoon sun. Matteo, the master finally said, may I ask some questions that may seem strange at first glance? Certainly, Maestro. Anything that can help me understand this situation. During these 6 months of empty nets, did you stop to observe other things that were happening while you were fishing? Or were you focused exclusively on the absence of fish? Matteo frowned, confused by the unexpected nature of the question. Well, I was mainly concerned with the lack of fish, obviously. That's the purpose of being in the ocean, to fish. But what else did you see during those hours at sea? Describe a typical morning of these last few months, but don't focus on the fish that weren't there. Focus on everything else that was present. Matteo closed his eyes and tried to consciously remember, trying to reconstruct not only his frustrations but the entire experience of being in the ocean during recent months. Well, he began, hesitantly, the mornings have been extraordinarily beautiful, now that you make me think about it. The sunrise over the Sierra de la Laguna has been particularly spectacular colors I had never noticed before. Pink and gold and orange, reflecting on the water. Like he stopped abruptly, realizing he was straying from what he considered the important topic. Continue, Maestro Domingo encouraged gently. What else did you observe? Well, there have been an unusual number of dolphins in the bay. Whole groups that appear almost every day, playing around my boat, jumping and swimming in patterns that are almost like a dance. Also flocks of seagulls and other seabirds in quantities I had never seen before, and whales. Several times I've seen whales passing in the distance, which is quite rare at this time of year. And how did these experiences make you feel? Asked the master. Well, at other times in my life I would have been amazed, Matteo admitted honestly, but during these months I mainly felt frustrated because all these creatures were clearly thriving in the ocean, while I couldn't even find a simple fish. And your interactions with other fishermen during this period, how have they been? Curiously better than ever, Matteo replied, surprised by his own answer. When my nets were always full, I tended to fish alone and return home quickly to sell my catch. But now, as I spend more time at sea without success, I've talked much more with other fishermen I meet. I've discovered fascinating stories about their families, learned different techniques, and developed real friendships with men I only knew superficially for decades. And your relationship with Isabella during these difficult months. Matteo smiled involuntarily for the first time in weeks. Ironically, our connection has been deeper than in years, he said. When I was constantly worried about business and always rushing to sell fish, I often arrived home too tired for meaningful conversations, but now, as we are facing this difficulty together, we have spent hours every night talking about dreams, memories, plans, philosophies of life, things we had stopped discussing during years of prosperous routine. Maestro Domingo smiled with an expression that mixed ancient wisdom and genuine joy. "Mateo," he said, "would you like me to suggest a completely different perspective on your current situation?" "Please, Maestro. What if your nets are not empty? What if, instead, they are being filled with catches completely different from those you expected to find?" "I don't understand what you mean. During these 6 months, you have captured experiences of natural beauty that went unnoticed during decades of exclusive focus on fishing. You captured deeper connections with other human beings. You captured a renewed intimacy with your wife. You captured moments of contemplation and reflection that you never had time to experience. During years of constant activity, you captured patience, humility, flexibility, and an expanded capacity to find meaning beyond immediate material success. You captured a renewed appreciation for non-monetary abundances that have always been present in your life, but became invisible during decades of routine prosperity. More importantly, the Master continued, you captured a rare opportunity to redefine who you are beyond your profession. For 30 years, you were Mateo, the successful fisherman. Now you have the chance to discover who Mateo, the complete human being, is. Mateo felt something move deeply in his chest, as if an emotional dam that had been contained for months was beginning to slowly open. "But Maestro," he said, still partially resisting the new perspective, "how will I support my family if I can't fish? What other skills and abilities have you developed during your life that could be valuable to your community?" Dogen asked. Mateo thought carefully for a few moments. "Well, I know these waters better than anyone in the region. I could guide other fishermen, or even tourists who want to experience traditional Mexican fishing. I know how to repair boats and nets with a skill that few possess. I could open a repair shop. I understand weather patterns and sea conditions that could be useful to the local port, and ... He stopped, realizing there were more possibilities than he had previously considered. "And Isabella always said I'm a good storyteller about life at sea. Maybe I could teach children about fishing traditions, or work with the local maritime museum. ... See how your nets weren't really empty," said Maestro Domingo with a radiant smile. They were capturing opportunities, insights, relationships, and discoveries about yourself that only became visible when you stopped being obsessed exclusively with one specific type of abundance. "Now," the Master continued, "I want you to do an experiment for the next 30 days. Continue fishing if you want, but completely change your intention. Instead of going to sea to catch fish, go to capture beauty, connection, contemplation, and discovery. Go as a student of the ocean, not as an exploiter of it. Consciously observe everything your nets are really capturing, every experience, every insight, every moment of peace, every meaningful conversation with other fishermen, every spectacular sunrise, every encounter with marine life. Keep a diary of these unconventional catches, and at the end of 30 days, honestly assess whether your nets have truly been empty, or if they have been consistently full of treasures that you simply weren't trained to recognize as valuable." Mateo left the temple that afternoon with a completely transformed perspective. During the following 30 days, he continued his morning fishing expeditions, but with a radically different attitude. Instead of anxious tension about results, he approached each morning in the ocean as an opportunity for mobile meditation and contemplative discovery. The results were extraordinary. His sketchlogs quickly filled with observations of natural phenomena he'd ignored for decades. Complex current patterns creating mandalas on the water's surface, intricate seabird behaviors revealing sophisticated social intelligence, subtle shifts in water, color, and texture that told stories of natural cycles and underwater ecosystems. His conversations with fellow fishermen deepened into philosophical discussions about the meaning of sea life, family memories revealing rich histories of the coastal community's evolution, and practical collaborations that resulted in genuine, lasting friendships. Most surprisingly, on the 23rd day of the experiment, while completely relaxed and observing a playful pod of dolphins, Kenji's nets suddenly overflowed with the largest catch of his entire life, not just in quantity, but in the extraordinary quality and variety of fish the likes of which even experienced local merchants had never seen. "How do you explain this?" Akari asked that night as they sorted through an almost impossible amount of fresh fish. "Honestly, I don't know," Kenji replied, "but I suspect that when I stopped trying to force the ocean to give me what I wanted and started gratefully receiving all it was offering, something fundamental changed in the nature of our relationship. It's like for 30 years I was shouting demands at the sea, and finally learned to listen to what it had always been trying to teach me." Kenji continued fishing for many years after this transformative experience, but never again with the obsessive anxiety that had characterized his first 3 decades in the profession. His catches became abundant and regular again, but he also developed multiple income streams based on his other skills and discoveries. More importantly, he never forgot the fundamental lesson of those 6 months of empty nets. True abundance often comes disguised as apparent scarcity, and life's most valuable gifts are often invisible to minds focused exclusively on specific goals and limited expectations. Empty nets, he used to teach young fishermen visiting his small maritime museum years later, are often fuller than overflowing nets. The difference lies in the quality of our attention and the depth of our appreciation for what we're truly receiving each moment. Today, when you find yourself in situations where your efforts aren't producing the specific results you expected, perhaps a professional project that isn't progressing as planned, a relationship that isn't developing as you wished, or personal goals that seem constantly out of reach, remember Kenji's empty nets. Ask yourself what other forms of abundance might be offered in this situation that you're not recognizing because you're focused exclusively on one specific type of outcome. What skills, insights, relationships, or perspectives might you be developing during this seemingly unproductive period? Sometimes, the greatest catches of our lives come precisely during periods when it seems we're not catching anything we originally sought, and this discovery of how a shift in perspective can reveal hidden abundances in apparent failures brings to mind an 8th and final deeply touching story, one that unfolded during the final moments of a master who was about to offer his last and most precious teaching on gratitude. Story 8. Master Avalokiteshvara's last day, high in the sacred Andes Mountains of Peru, where the air is so crisp each breath feels like a cleansing, stood the ancient monastery of Coricancha, built over 500 years ago into the rocky slopes that seemed to brush the clouds. Within its weathered stone walls, which had witnessed generations of spiritual seekers, lived one of the most revered Buddhist masters in all of South America, the Venerable Avalokiteshvara, an 87-year-old man whose compassionate wisdom had illuminated countless lives. During over 60 years of dedicated teaching, the name Avalokiteshvara, meaning the one who hears the world's sounds in Sanskrit, had been chosen by the master himself when he became a monk at 22, after abandoning a privileged life as the son of a noble family to fully dedicate himself to the path of enlightenment and service to sentient beings. For 6 extraordinary decades, he had become known not only for his profound understanding of the most esoteric Buddhist teachings, but primarily for his unique ability to find and teach genuine gratitude even in the most challenging circumstances of human existence. Hundreds of disciples had passed through the monastery during his spiritual leadership, coming from all corners of South America and, more recently, from the Western world. Some were young students seeking initial spiritual guidance. Others were experienced practitioners seeking refinement of their understanding. And many were ordinary people facing existential crises that only the wisdom of a realized master could help resolve. What made Master Avalokiteshvara truly extraordinary was not just his encyclopedic knowledge of the sacred sutras or his ability to remain in deep meditative states for days on end, but his seemingly magical ability to help anyone, no matter how desperate, bitter, or lost, discover authentic reasons for gratitude and appreciation for life. Gratitude, he used to teach, is not a feeling you have when things are going well. It's a way of perceiving that reveals the hidden blessings present in every moment, especially those that seem most difficult or devoid of meaning. For the past 2 years, however, the master had been battling a progressive illness that slowly weakened his physical body. Although his mind remained perfectly clear and his spiritual presence seemed to intensify as his physical form became more fragile. The doctors had been clear: it was an incurable condition that would eventually lead to his physical death, probably within a few months. The monastery community had watched with a mixture of deep sadness and reverent admiration as the master faced his own imminent mortality. Instead of bitterness, depression, or even resigned acceptance, Avalokiteshvara demonstrated a radiant serenity and an even deeper gratitude that seemed to grow proportionally to the proximity of his final departure. "My dear disciples," he had said during one of his last formal lectures, 3 weeks before the day that would become known as the Master's last day, "do not grieve the impermanence of this physical form. Use my transition as an opportunity to understand the deeper truth about gratitude. It does not depend on external circumstances, lifespan, or the absence of suffering. It is an intrinsic quality of awakened consciousness that can flourish, especially in moments of greatest challenge." It was a particularly beautiful September morning when the mountain air carried the scent of Andean wildflowers, and the distant sound of temple bells echoed through the valleys like celestial music, that Master Avalokiteshvara awoke knowing with absolute certainty that this would be his last day in this physical existence. It wasn't a vague intuition or an anxious premonition, but a clear and serene knowledge that arose from a deep understanding of the natural rhythms of his own body and spirit. Instead of anguish or fear, he felt an extraordinary joy and a gratitude so intense that it seemed to radiate from every cell of his being like golden light. It was as if his entire life, every experience, every lesson, every moment of joy and suffering was coming together in a grand symbol of recognition for the extraordinary opportunity to have consciously existed in such a magnificently complex and interconnected universe. He spent the first moments of the morning in silent meditation, not trying to cling to life or resist death, but simply resting in deep appreciation for all he had experienced during 87 years of conscious human existence. Gentle waves of memories of thousands of precious moments arose in his mind. The first ray of sun he had seen as a child, the taste of fresh water after a hot day, the sound of his mother's laughter, the feeling of compassion blossoming in his heart during his early years as a monk, the look of understanding in the eyes of disciples when they finally grasped a profound teaching. After his morning meditation, he asked all the monastery residents, 23 monks of various ages and origins, to gather in the central garden, where a single, centuries-old weruro tree offered refreshing shade and a silent presence that had always inspired deep contemplation. "My dear brothers and spiritual children," the Master said in a voice that, despite physical weakness, carried a serene authority and a radiant love that deeply touched everyone present. "Today is a very special day, not because something sad is happening, but because something extraordinarily beautiful is being completed. I feel with absolute certainty that this physical form will complete its journey today, and my spirit will transition to the next phase of existence. But do not gather here to lament a loss. Gather to celebrate a final discovery about the nature of true gratitude." The disciples sat in a circle around their beloved Master, some with tears already welling up in their eyes, others trying to maintain spiritual composure, all deeply touched by the extraordinary serenity that emanated from Avalokiteshvara like an invisible perfume. "For 60 years of teaching," the Master continued, "I have tried to convey to you the understanding that gratitude is not an emotional reaction to favorable circumstances, but a fundamental way of perceiving that can transform any experience, including suffering and death, into an opportunity for profound appreciation. Today, I want to offer you a final and practical demonstration of this truth, using my own death as a teaching laboratory." The closest disciple, a young monk named Tenzin, who had served as the Master's personal assistant for the past 5 years, could not contain his emotion. "Master," he said in a choked voice, "how can we feel gratitude when we are losing the wisest and most compassionate person we have ever known? How can there be blessing in the death of someone who dedicates their entire life to alleviating the suffering of others?" Avalokiteshvara smiled with a tenderness so profound that it seemed to embrace not only Tenzin, but all the pain and confusion any human being had ever felt in the face of the reality of loss and "Tenzin, my dear son," he replied, "your question is precisely the gateway to deeper understanding. Allow me to guide you through an exercise that can completely transform how you view not only my death, but any apparent loss in your own lives. First, I want you to consider not what you are losing today, but all that you have gained during the years we have spent together. Do not focus on future absence, but on the past and present abundance that can never be taken from you." "Tenzin, can you tell me 3 specific things you have learned during our time together that will remain with you forever, regardless of what happens to this physical form?" Tenzin closed his eyes and breathed deeply before answering. "I have learned that true compassion is not just feeling sorry for others, but seeing our fundamental connection with all suffering and all joy. I have learned that wisdom is not in having answers to everything, but in asking ever deeper questions. And I have learned that every moment, even moments of pain, contains opportunities for spiritual growth that can only be discovered through full attention and an open heart." "Excellent," said the Master, radiating warm approval. "Now tell me, do these understandings die when my body dies?" "No, Master. They live in me and in everyone you have taught, and they will continue to live through all the people we will teach." "Then where is the real loss?" Avalokiteshvara gently asked, "What was truly present between us? Love, wisdom, spiritual understanding, growth of consciousness, all of this not only remains, but actually multiplies through every person you will positively touch for the rest of your life." The master turned to another disciple, a middle-aged man named Lobsang, who had arrived at the monastery 5 years earlier during a deep crisis of depression and feelings of worthlessness. Lobsang, Avalokiteshvara said, "When you arrived here, do you remember how you felt about your own life?" "I felt like a complete failure," Lobsang replied honestly. "I had lost my job, my wife had left me, my children didn't want to talk to me, and I was convinced that my existence was a mistake of the universe. And now, 5 years later, how do you see your life?" Lobsang smiled through his tears. "Now I see that all those losses were actually liberations that brought me to the spiritual path. I developed a capacity for compassion that I never knew I possessed. I found an inner peace that no external circumstance can shake. And I discovered that my real purpose in life is to help others who are going through similar crises. So my death," the master said softly, "is different from those losses you experienced years ago. Or could it be yet another apparent loss that actually opens doors to forms of growth and service that we cannot yet imagine?" A profound silence fell over the circle as each disciple contemplated this revolutionary perspective. "Master," said a young nun named Pema, "how can we feel real gratitude for your death, not just intellectual understanding, but true gratitude from the heart?" "Pema," Avalokiteshvara replied, his eyes shining with a joy that seemed to come from dimensions beyond ordinary human experience. "True gratitude arises when we stop resisting reality and begin to trust the fundamental wisdom of the universe. For 87 years, this universe has offered me an extraordinary human experience. It allowed me to be born into a loving family, to discover the spiritual path, to serve as a vehicle for teachings that can alleviate suffering, to know hundreds of beautiful souls like yourselves, to experience the depths of meditation and the heights of compassion. Now, this same wise universe is offering me the experience of conscious death and spiritual transition. Why should I trust its wisdom during the years of life, but resist it during the moment of death? Death is simply the next adventure on a cosmic journey that is infinitely larger than any individual life, and I am deeply grateful to have had a life so full of meaning that I can depart without regrets, knowing that I have planted seeds of wisdom that will continue to flourish through you and everyone you will touch." As the day progressed, Master Avalokiteshvara spent individual time with each disciple, offering final words of guidance, personalized blessings, and transmissions of wisdom specific to each person's unique spiritual needs. There was no rush, anxiety, or sense of desperate urgency, only a timeless quality of total presence and unconditional love. In the afternoon, he asked to be taken to his favorite meditation spot, a small stone platform built on the edge of a cliff that offered a panoramic view of endless valleys covered in verdant forests and mountains that stretched to the horizon like waves on a terrestrial ocean. "This is the perfect place," he said, sitting in the lotus position with an ease that defied his physical frailty to make the final transition. His disciples gathered around him in concentric circles, softly chanting sacred mantras they had learned during years of practice together. The sound of their unified voices created a harmony that seemed to unite earth and sky, time and eternity, human sadness and cosmic joy. As the sun began to approach the western horizon, painting the entire sky in shades of gold, rose, and purple that rivaled any artwork ever created, Master Avalokiteshvara spoke his last words to the assembled community. "My dear children," he said, his voice now weaker physically, but carrying a spiritual authority that seemed to emanate from realms beyond the material world. "Promise me one thing. When you remember me, remember not with sadness the man who died, but with joyful gratitude for the love that lived among us and that can never die. And when you face your own losses, difficulties, and eventually your own deaths, remember this fundamental truth: the universe never takes anything from us without giving something even greater in return. Sometimes we need spiritual eyes to see the gift hidden within the apparent loss, but the gift is always there. The deepest gratitude is not for things that remain, but for things that transform us, and transformation always requires that something ends so that something new can begin." As the first stars began to appear in the gradually darkening sky, Master Avalokiteshvara closed his eyes, assumed the meditation posture he had practiced for 65 years, and entered a state of contemplative absorption so profound that his breathing became imperceptible and his physical presence seemed to dissolve into the infinite vastness of pure consciousness. His disciples continued chanting softly throughout the night, creating a field of sacred energy that sustained the transition of their beloved master. And when the first golden rays of the morning sun touched his serene face the following day, all could see that he had departed peacefully during the quiet hours before dawn. But what was most extraordinary was that, instead of devastation or despair, every person present felt a deep and inexplicable gratitude, not in spite of the master's passing, but because of the way he had used even his death as a final lesson on finding hidden blessings in life's most challenging experiences. In the years that followed, Avalokita's disciples spread across the globe, carrying with them not only his teachings on compassion and wisdom, but primarily his revolutionary understanding of transformative gratitude. They established learning centers, wrote books, and created programs that helped thousands discover how to find genuine appreciation even in the most difficult moments of their lives. And whenever someone inquired about the source of their extraordinary wisdom on gratitude, they recounted the story of Master Avalokita's last day, a man who transformed his own death into a final lesson on how true abundance comes not from avoiding loss, but from recognizing the transformative gifts always hidden within every apparent ending. Today, when you face losses, endings, or transitions that seem only destructive and painful, perhaps the end of a cherished relationship, the loss of a job that defined your identity, the death of someone you love, or life changes that force you to abandon familiar versions of yourself, remember Master Avalokita's final lesson. Ask yourself, what transformative gift might be hidden within this apparent loss? What new version of yourself might be trying to be born through this experience of ending and beginning? How might this present difficulty be preparing you for forms of growth, service, or understanding that are only possible after certain old structures dissolve? The deepest gratitude is not for the absence of challenges, but for the constant presence of opportunities for transformation, even when these opportunities come disguised as painful endings that we initially resist with our whole being. And so, in these 8 stories that have journeyed with us from the icy mountains of the Himalayas to the tranquil waters of Kyoto, from opulent palaces to simple cottages, from moments of obvious abundance to periods of seeming scarcity, a fundamental truth about gratitude has emerged as a golden thread connecting all human experiences. True gratitude is not a feeling we have when everything is going well. It's a way of perceiving that reveals the extraordinary abundance that is always present but often remains invisible to minds focused only on what is lacking, on what could be better, or on what we fear losing. Each grain of rice carries the history of the universe. Each cup of water connects you to all the oceans and clouds of the world. Each breath is a gift from all the plants that produce oxygen. Each heartbeat is a miracle of cosmic coordination that sustains your consciousness in this present moment. When you truly see this, not just intellectually understand it, but viscerally perceive it with a completely open heart, complaining becomes impossible. Anxiety naturally dissolves, and abundance reveals itself as the fundamental truth of every moment, even in those moments that seem emptiest or most challenging. Tonight, as you allow these stories to settle in your soul like seeds of wisdom planted in fertile ground, remember that you are carrying with you not just memories of ancient teachings, but living invitations to perceive your own life with the eyes of awakened gratitude. May you sleep enveloped by the awareness of all the blessings that sustain your existence in this moment. May you awaken tomorrow with a renewed capacity to see miracles hidden in ordinary experiences, and may you carry in your heart the profound understanding that you are, always have been, and always will be profoundly abundant, not because you possess specific things, but because you are alive, conscious, and connected to the infinite web of love and wisdom that is the very essence of the universe. If this journey of gratitude has brought recognition and peace to your heart, write in the comments, "Gratitude transforms all," so that we can together create a current of recognized abundance that circulates throughout the world. If these stories have brought serenity to your night and awakened genuine gratitude in your heart, leave your like on this video. Each like is a vote of confidence that allows us to bring this ancestral Buddhist wisdom to even more people seeking to transform nighttime anxiety into deep appreciation for life. Subscribe to the channel to receive weekly new journeys of Buddhist wisdom that transform restless nights into sacred periods of inner growth and restorative sleep, and activate notifications by tapping the bell to be notified whenever we post new nighttime practices that convert worry into recognition. Your soul deserves this constant refuge of peace. Rest in peace, dear soul. The universe is taking care of you, as it always has, as it always will. May all beings find gratitude. May all beings sleep in peace. May all beings awaken in the light of recognition.